I am excited to be going into the attic of the Madwoman. Um, with Gila Fine, the author. So Gila is very gracious and thanks all kinds of people in her introduction, in her acknowledgments. But I want to say that what I picked up on that she might have also recognized as expressing some gratitude for were like BBC mystery series. Because in every single chapter of the 6 chapters, she presents these Talmudic readings. And for those of us who know Talmud, somewhat. These are not, deep dives. These are kind of, I wouldn't say top 10, but, maybe top 100. Because they've got women as their protagonists, the named women of the Talmud. And so, for anybody who's been paying attention to Talmudic studies in the academic world or in the yeshiva world for the past 30 years, these are stories that are not unknown. But from the beginning that she's going to give you this reading, this plain, superficial, relatively quick reading. And you know that by the end, she's going to stand things on their head. So it's like this mystery. Okay, which word is she going to show? How is she going to get in there to turn things upside down? Are you going to end up being turned upside down? So it was a real like pleasure for the mystery reader or the mystery viewer in me to see, okay, I know that something is going to happen, right? Nobody died. Oh, that's not true. Like somebody died, Gila. I don't mean to give it away. I'm not going to tell you who died. Okay. But it was really exciting to go through these because you know that there's going to be some subversion, some revolution, some kind of totally new, innovative way of looking at the text. And for those of us who are text readers, who have fallen in love with the text, Gila was like a shadchanit, right? Making the match between reader and sugya to really just kind of excite you. So with that, I want to turn it over to Gila with my first question, which is, what made you write this particular book, this style of book? And, in particular, who did you have in mind when you were doing the writing? Like, who was your ideal reader?
Wow. I think anything I say at this point will be a calm down. I want to just end the event here. That was such a beautiful introduction. I think I'm not sure I can do justice to that. Can we just like end it here and you can then read the book and be done?
How about if you're like the
Thank you.
Agatha Christie of Talmudic tales? I like that.
I'll take it. I'll take it. I wish you were around when I was trying to figure out the back cover copy of Shai. That would have been really useful. Really, thank you for that extremely generous introduction. And hello, CSP. It is lovely to be with you all. It's always lovely to be with you all. But I'm particularly excited to be with you. What is my evening, your daytime? Uh, this is, in fact, the first international launch of the book. It's available for sale, but it's not officially out. I believe it's the publisher set the publication date for the 1st of June. But Ari and Shirel basically said, okay, but it's CSP. You have to give us something. You have to do something special for CSP. And I thought, of all the places I teach, if I had to choose one to sort of give a preview to, it would be CSP, which holds a very, very special place in my heart. Thank you for all of the very kind messages in the chat. I'm not going to respond to them individually, but thank you. Okay. Why did I choose to write this book, I think was the question that was asked, and who did I write it for? Was that correct? Why did I choose to write this book? I'm going to put it out there that I did not choose to write this book. I don't think people choose to write books, or if they do, they're masochists. They ought to have their head examined. I don't think this is a sane or reasonable choice for anyone to make. You can contradict me, Shai, if you feel otherwise, but in my mind, you don't choose to write a book. You write a book because you are compelled to write it, because you have no choice but to write it, because there's something burning within you that has to get out. And in my particular case, what was burning within me is this, and sort of how I open the book. This book really begins 3 days before my 12th birthday. I was on a family visit to my grandparents in London. My entire family went out to the Science Museum for the day, and I was left behind, kind of like in Rumpelstiltskin, in a room with a pile of my grandfather's books and strict instructions to write my bar mitzvah speech. To this day, I have no idea why my parents thought that was a good idea to let me just write it on my own, but that is what they did. And not knowing much about anything really, I just reached for the first book on the pile, which was Sefer HaAgadah, that monumental collection of the stories of rabbinic literature, organized according to theme, edited by Bialik and Ovnitsky. And I opened to the subject of woman because I figured bat mitzvah. And I started to read. 3 stories in, I felt a little bit uneasy. By the 10th, I was sobbing, crying as only a nearly 12-year-old can. I was so hurt. I was so deeply offended that the rabbis, who were very much the heroes of my childhood and the architects of my religion, that they could have such a low opinion of me and my kind. The women in their stories were weak. They were irrational. They were greedy and petty and promiscuous and vain. One of the first sources read, Nivre'a isha nivra satan ima. When woman was created, the devil was created with her. The woman was the mother of all vice. 3 days before your bat mitzvah is not the best time to have your religion come crashing down, but that is more or less what happened to me that day. I cherry-picked a couple quotes from my speech, but nothing was ever the same for me after that. The simple faith of my childhood was gone, and in its place were pain and confusion and doubt. I fought to make peace with a religion that I so loved, knowing that its founding fathers felt about me the way that they did. I spent years questioning and searching and reading anything I could get my hands on. After graduating high school and completing my national youth service, I went to seminary to study Talmud, which was forbidden to me growing up because I grew up in a world that believed that Kol ha-melamed bito Torah ki'ilu limdat tiflut. Anyone who teaches his daughter Talmud teaches her licentiousness, which if you studied Booyah with me, you would be familiar with. But it was only really when I went to university to study literature that I found the answers I was looking for. Learning to read literature in general and rabbinic literature in particular, I discovered that these stories are not at all what they first seem to be, that there is a great deal more to the women of the Talmud than initially meets the eye, and that the rabbis had some surprising, so as not to say surprisingly, proto-feminist ideas of marriage, childbirth, sex, and what it meant to be a woman in the world. It took me over a decade of intense religious struggle, but the stories of the Talmud that sent me spiraling into this religious crisis ended up becoming my constant study and my greatest joy. And so, who did I write this book for? I want to say first and foremost, I wrote it for my 12-year-old self. I wrote it for anyone who, like me, is fighting to make their peace with their religion. I wrote it for anyone who is struggling with the place of women in Judaism. In fact, with the place of any marginalized minority in Judaism. One of the central claims of the book is that when the rabbis tell the story of a woman, 9 times out of 10, they're telling a story of an other with a capital O. I wrote it for anyone who, opening the Talmud or the Torah, is confronted with the inevitable and sometimes heartbreaking gaps between what they believe and what they think the text is saying. These are painful questions, and if this book can help spare anyone the pain that I went through, then that is what I wrote it for.
That was a painful answer. And, Gila, I moved from the academic world to the rabbinic world, so I want to ask a follow-up question. When you were thrown into this tiz, Did you think about, or did you go to one of your rabbis to help you try to navigate this new landscape that you had been exposed to?
Like many women in the Orthodox world, I didn't have an automatic rabbinic figure to go to. I didn't have any kind of personal relationship to any rabbinic figure. I went to books. I went to many books, many of them by rabbis. And so the rabbis uh, I sought answers from were writers of classical works of Jewish philosophy. But as I say, I think the main key to the answers that I was looking for came actually from literature and not necessarily rabbis. They came from literary theorists. They came from my literature professors. They're the ones who really showed me how to read these texts in a way that gets at their deeper meaning. And so I suppose I could be resentful that I had nobody to take me by the hand and show me the way. I suppose I could be angry that I had to sort of chart my way on my own, and that was a much harder thing to do. But um, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is when Joseph says to his brother, um, "Al te'atzvu ki machartem oti hena ki lemichya shachani Elokim lifnechem." I think is how it goes. Joseph recognizes that he had to go through the difficulty that he had to go through to put him in a position to help. And you might say that is a framing, but I think it's a really positive, constructive framing. And so, as I say, if I had to go through that more difficult path in order to hopefully be able to spare the difficulty from others, then I'm thankful for that.
Okay, thank you. So those of us who have been reading Talmudic stories for the last 30 years, we've looked at stories through cultural poetics, through gender analysis, through folklore analysis, um, through comparisons with other ancient Near Eastern, Babylonian, right? Lots of different prisms have been used to explicate, to bring up nuances in the text that if you didn't have it to compare it to other things, it would slip by you. I am so excited to tell everybody, have introduced a new prism to look at these women of the Talmud through, and that is the archetype, right? So as far as I know, no one, right, in the traditional world or in the academic world has brought archetypal analysis to bear, and what a rich prism it turns out to be in order to look at these stories. So how did you arrive at that kind of understanding of how rich it would be to look at these stories through archetypal analysis?
Again, thank you. And again, I don't want to follow that up with anything because that was just so beautiful, and I feel like it's going to go downhill from there. Uh, so the conceit of the book is I look at the 6 named heroines of the Talmud. There are 52 named women in all of rabbinic literature, which is negligibly small. Of these 52, I look at the 6 who not only have their own name, but are actually heroines of their own rich literary narrative. And these are Yalta the shrew, Choma the femme fatale, Marta the prima donna, Cheruta the Madonna whore, Boya the overeatrix, and Ima Shalom the angel in the house. And I imagine those of you who've learned with me before are familiar with at least some of these characters. And that is, in fact, the point of departure for each of these 6 chapters in the book. Is I begin with a sort of a cross-cultural survey of the particular archetype, the feminine, or rather the anti-feminine archetype of this particular heroine. So, for instance, To understand the story of Yalta the Shrew, I look at Vashti and Xanthippe and the Wife of Bath and Shakespeare's Caterina Minola and Dame Van Winkle. Or if I'm trying to make sense of Martha the prima donna, I read the stories of Marie Antoinette and Madame Bovary and Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Norma Desmond and Miss Piggy. And this really has always been the way that I have both learned and taught rabbinic literature. I've always read these stories in light of similar narratives, from myth to folklore to fiction to film. And when I initially started doing this, I really had no consciousness that this was in any way new or original or different. In my mind, this was just, doesn't everybody teach Talmud this way? My very first teaching experience, I was very unqualified. Arguably, I am unqualified still. But when I first started, I was extremely unqualified. I taught a group of 10 of my peers. We were all very young, in someone's living room. And from the very beginning, I brought in other literary texts because in my mind, that was just what you did, because the Talmud was a foreign and sometimes forbidding text to many people. And by bringing in examples from classical and popular culture, you make the Talmud seem a bit more familiar, a bit more relevant. You make the text come to life. And that is what I did. And then by the third week, one of the people in the small group said, "Why are you bringing in all these goyim? Like, why do I need the goyim to understand Talmud?" And I thought, okay, fair point. I should think about that. So I went away and I thought about it. And I came back with this answer. The stories of the Talmud are fundamentally scenic. They are written like a play or a drama to be enacted on a stage. And like with plays, they tell us what characters say and do, but not what they think or feel. And so it's up to us to really tease out the emotional subtext of the story. And bringing in other literary examples is a really good way of getting into the heads and the hearts of the characters of the Talmud. The characters of the Talmud might not tell us what they're feeling, but then we have characters in Shakespeare, for instance, who have endlessly long monologues telling us exactly how they're feeling, and sometimes bringing in that piece of Shakespeare or a piece of poetry or a monologue from a 19th century novel is kind of helpful in shining a light on these emotional moments in the stories. And so that was the answer that I gave, and that was the answer that I gave for many years subsequently. But I stayed with the question, and I kept thinking about it, and I kept exploring it, because at some point I discovered, as Shai said, that really not everybody teaches Talmud this way. In fact, the more I looked into it, the more I realized nobody was teaching Talmud this way, at least not systematically, and it was very much systematic with me. And so I kept digging, and then I realized that this is, in fact, a thing. This is actually a legitimate literary theory. It is called archetypal analysis or archetypal criticism, as Shai said. It's a theory that is based on the insights of Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung, that telling stories is a very basic way that we humans have of working through our primal fears and fantasies. The stories that we tell, from ancient Chinese myths to all the way to contemporary Hollywood cinema, are all essentially the same, because they all are a working through of the same primal feelings. Jung calls this the collective unconscious. And so if you see an archetype, and this could be a character type, a plot element, a motif, if a particular archetype recurs in stories throughout history and across culture, you can assume with a high degree of probability that the root of that archetype is not cultural, but psychological, that it derives deep within the human psyche. And I find this endlessly fascinating. Archetypes are one of the most direct windows that we have into the human soul. And so part of what I do in the book is I try and uncover the psychological root for each of these anti-feminine archetypes. For instance, why does each culture have a story of a man seduced and destroyed by an irresistibly beautiful femme fatale? What does that tell us about our own anxieties surrounding our sexual desire? But I'll say one more thing. I think the ultimate reason for using archetypal analysis in the study of Talmud and why it really is so incredibly rich and fruitful, the ultimate reason is this. The rabbis weren't just really good at adopting archetypes from other literary traditions, they were also experts in adapting these archetypes, reworking them in order to suit their own religious or moral agenda. So if archetypes are, as I said, a direct window into the human soul, the rabbinic reworking of an archetype is a direct window into the rabbinic mindset. We learn so much about what the rabbis thought about things from the way they play with these archetypes, and they play with these archetypes extremely often. And specifically when it comes to these anti-feminine archetypes in the stories that I look at in the book, the rabbis almost consistently, not quite consistently, but almost consistently invoke these archetypes in order to deconstruct them, to turn them on their head, as Rav Shai said earlier. You think you're reading a story about a raging shrew or a manipulative femme fatale or a perfect angel in the house, and we say the rabbis are here to tell you that that is nothing of the sort, that this woman is way more complex than the one-dimensional archetype that you took her to be. And the fact that you took her to be it ought to tell you something about the way you misread the characters in the text, but also about the way you misread and mistreat the characters in your lives. And so there are deep moral lessons that are implicit in the way these archetypes are deployed by the rabbis and then deconstructed.
All right, so let's stay on that ethical note about mistreating the people in your lives and how that might be reflected in the ways in which the rabbis are very artfully constructing these stories. I'm not going to reveal any spoilers, don't worry. But in your conclusion, you bring what, to my mind, is the most unsettling and the most revelatory aspects of your entire project that in some ways you were holding relatively close to your vest. What is what did I forgot what I called it in English, in British English.
Waistcoat. My
Waistcoat.
waistcoated
Yes,
chest.
you were holding your cards close to your waistcoat. And I guess, can you speak about the process of going from the micro analysis of each of those stories to the larger generalizations that you were making about the place that the rabbis, I don't know, maybe you can't do this without giving a spoiler, but then give a little teaser of a spoiler, Gila. Because you still get so much enjoyment and so geschmack, it's so rich reading each of the six. But in the conclusion, you talk about how the rabbis may have been reflecting on their own self-identities in this larger world in which they found themselves after the destruction of the temple.
So again, I fear the answers aren't going to be as good as the questions because the questions are so great. Thank you. I'll also say that I'm seeing a lot of very lively chat in the chat, which I'm not reading, but we are going to leave some time. We're going to try and sort of end this part of the program relatively early and leave some time for a proper Q&A at the end. So this idea of invoking an archetype to deconstruct it, which the rabbis do fairly frequently, presenting a thesis in order to turn that thesis on its head, this is a very central feature of rabbinic storytelling. One of the hallmarks of rabbinic stories is what I call the false front. What you think a rabbinic story is saying and what it's actually saying are often diametrically opposed to one another. The rabbis wrote their stories so as to deliberately mislead us, such that if you only read the story once, you will come away with the wrong idea. So rabbinic stories can never just be read. They must always be reread. Excuse me. And that is what I do in the book. I read every story twice. Once, in order to understand its surface meaning, to see what it says at face value. I call this the primary reading. And then a second time to try and uncover the deeper truth that is hidden between the lines. I call this revisioning, which is a phrase that I borrowed from Adrian Rich, who said, revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction. This is for us an act of survival. I'm not sure Adrian Rich knew Talmud, but this is a perfect way, I think, of reading Talmud. You've got to read a Talmudic story twice, but it's not just about technically reading the story 2 times. There's also a very specific set of rules that you have to apply to your rereading or revisioning of the text. If you are going to sort of break through the false front and get at the deeper truth of the story. And if you've studied with me at any point, you probably know what I'm about to say, because I say this practically with every class I give. To read a story in the Talmud, there are 2 things we need to do. Oh, Laura has it. Thank you, Laura. You are well trained. We have to zoom in and do a close and careful reading of the text. And we have to zoom out and examine the different levels of context. And if we do that, we will find more often than not that the false front of the story falls away, and in its place emerges a deeper, more complex, sometimes far more radical truth that the rabbis wished for us to learn. Now, you asked why the rabbis do this, and this in my mind really is possibly the most interesting thing about rabbinic storytelling. I believe, and I say this at some point, you're right, quite late in the book, because I don't want to give the game away too early, the rabbis want to deliberately mislead us. They go to such lengths to conceal what they really want for us to learn, because they want for us to know firsthand how easy it is to misread, to misinterpret, to come away with the wrong idea. If you revision a text, you will realize how grossly you had misread it the first time, how prone you yourself are to misinterpretation, and how important it is to try and avoid that misinterpretation, both in your reading and in your life. And so how do you avoid this kind of misinterpretation? Well, as Laura said earlier, you zoom in and zoom out. You apply to life the very same reading rules that you apply to your reading of rabbinic stories. You zoom in and do a close reading. That means taking into account each and every detail, listening closely to what's been said, looking carefully at the silences. It means being sensitive. Then you zoom out. This means considering the bigger picture, realizing that there might be other circumstances of which you are unaware. This means being humble. You also, as I said earlier, have to tease out the emotional subtext, put yourself into the heads and the hearts of the characters. This means being empathetic. And this, for me at least, is the true genius of rabbinic storytelling. It's a perfect coming together of form and content. Rabbinic stories don't just teach us to be more moral. The very act of reading them makes us so. The very skills that we hone and put into play in order to be able to unpack a rabbinic story are the skills that are going to make us more moral. These stories force us, in the process of their own revisioning, to look below the surface. And they shape us as their readers to be more sensitive, to be more humble, to be more empathetic, to be more moral, both in our reading and in our life.
Okay, thank you. And I just want everybody to know Gila's response was an example of the artistry of self-restraint. She didn't give it all away. There is still what to read in the conclusion. Okay, Gila, follow up to that question. When you're talking about zooming in and zooming out, you are the zoomer, my friend. And one of the pitfalls of the kinds of literary analysis that you are doing is that it is extremely difficult to have controls for ensuring that the reading that you arrive at is what scholars call exegesis. You're getting it from the text rather than eisegesis, right? You're going from the zoom mechanism in your mind, and that is what is coloring your reading of the text. To some degree, everyone acknowledges that we can't get out of our own minds, right? We are situated where we are situated. But nevertheless, we also agree that there are better contextual readings than others. And so, can you talk a little bit about the process that you went through in coming up with these chidushim, these innovative readings that sometimes meshed with your own sensibility as a 21st century modern Orthodox woman, how you were able to kind of check yourself to see, well, wait a second, where am I getting this from?
That is a really, really good question, and I'm glad you said that, because this is really the point of departure. This is how I start the book. I posit that reading is a relationship, and just like in any relationship, or at least any healthy relationship, you don't go imposing yourself on the other person. I never set out to find feminism in the Talmud. Yes, we can't get out of our own minds. That is absolutely correct. And I believe that we have to bring our full selves to the encounter with the Talmudic text. All our beliefs, all our biases, we bring them in with us. We have to be aware of them. By the same token, we have to allow the Talmud to bring its full self with its beliefs and its biases to its encounter with us. We have to be able to speak at the Talmud. We also have to be prepared to listen to the Talmud. And if we're going to read the Talmud on its own terms rather than our own, we have to be prepared to listen even when the Talmud doesn't say exactly what we want to hear. And the Talmud very often doesn't say what we would like to hear. The Talmud is not feminist, much as we might love it to be. It's not even proto-feminist, although I do use that word sometimes in relation to the rabbis. The Talmud is a product of late antiquity, and so it is absolutely steeped in patriarchal thinking, at times even misogyny. And when we encounter those moments in the Talmud, we have to be able to acknowledge them. We have to be able to accept them, because these are the beliefs and the biases of the Talmud. And I do that quite a bit in the book. My contention is, and here I argue against the claim that is made all too often that the rabbis were chauvinists, that, Judaism has a woman's problem, etc., that every now and then the text transcends its historical context, and the rabbis tell a story that critiques patriarchal thought, or features a powerful woman, or suggests a feminine point of view. And the book essentially focuses on those very moments. Now, this was a question that bothered me as well. How do I convince people that this is not me imposing my 21st century feminist sensibilities on the text, that this is in fact coming out of the Talmud itself? Part of it is why I so clearly lay out the reading rules and how I intend to read the stories before I even begin. And then every reader can judge for themselves. Every reader can see the rules and see if I apply them correctly to the reading of the text. And that is really something that every reader must judge. But I did feel compelled to try and find a reason, because I myself was bothered by it. Can it be that the rabbis really were, if not proto-feminist, then at least acutely sensitive to what it meant to be a woman in the world? In fact, how could it be that the rabbis who lived in this age of antiquity, an age that was so pervaded by patriarchal thought, how could the rabbis, in a world where women were considered so foreign and so inferior, how could they be so sensitive to women as they are in the stories that I look at in the book? And the answer that kept coming up again and again as I explored this question within rabbinic literature is in a bit of a paradoxical fact, excuse me, that women for the rabbis were the paradigmatic other, as I said earlier. When the rabbis tell a story of a woman, 9 times out of 10, they're telling a story of an other with a capital O. But at the same time, women for the rabbis were the symbolic self. The Talmud says, Talmidei Chachamim domin lenashim. Torah scholars are similar to women. And this is an idea that comes up again and again in rabbinic literature. Rabbis are physically weak and delicate, just like women. Rabbis are indoor creatures, just like women. Rabbis are politically powerless, just like women. And in fact, it's not just themselves that the rabbis compare to women, it is the entire Jewish people. Rabbinic Judaism, it's a very curious thing. Rabbinic Judaism is created by men in a deeply patriarchal culture, and yet it was very much created in the image and likeness of women. The world of the rabbis is born, as you said earlier, out of the destruction. It's a world of exile and statelessness and subordination. And so without national sovereignty, Jews were to other nations what women were to men. They were subordinate and defenseless. They were politically disempowered, and sometimes they were physically persecuted. The Midrash says of the Jewish people, שצרתן צרת נקבה יולדת. מה נקבה טוענת ופורקת, כך ישראל משתעבדים ונגאלים. Meaning, the pains of the Jewish people are like the pains of a woman at childbirth. Just like a woman bears a burden and discharges it, so the Jews are enslaved and redeemed. I think the rabbis acknowledge that being a woman isn't easy, just like being Jewish isn't easy. But just like women learn to bear their burden, so Jews must learn to bear their burden. Which is why I think the rabbis tell so many stories of precisely this, of women who bear their burdens. The women in the stories that I discuss in the book are not perfect, as no human is, and certainly no Talmudic character is. And their stories are very often unhappy. You said nobody dies, but in fact, the vast majority of these stories are tragedies, and they do end in death. These are not always happy stories. But again and again, the women valiantly bear their burdens, and they rise to their challenges. And I think it's because the rabbis wanted us to know that no matter how downtrodden and oppressed we are as the Jewish people, like women, we can bear our burden and we can rise to the challenge, and we can do so with fortitude and with grace. And I will say one last thing, and with this I'll end. This final piece of the book I wrote during the first months of the October 7th War. And it took on a very special resonance at the time. Like the women in the book, we Jews aren't perfect, and our story isn't always happy. But just like these women in the book, we too, again and again, we bear our burden and we rise to the challenge, and we face our adversity with fortitude and with strength.
Indeed, so. Okay, so let me ask you what might be the final formal question, which is, as I finished the book and the conclusion, I wanted more. So, my question is, I would love to see this acted out, right? You talked about the cinematic quality. I would love to see this staged, and I thought about having my teen class look at these stories. We could read them together. We could read your analysis. I could bring them and their analyses together, and then we could perform it for the congregation, and their parents would just eat it up. But that's where I was going with it. I want you to tell me, where are you going? Do you have some more stories in your back pocket that you're thinking about bringing to our attention? Are you going to do more with these stories? Where are you going from here, Gila?
First of all, I want you to do that, please, Shai, and then I want you to invite me because I'm there. I'm there for that. I think these stories absolutely can and should be staged. They kind of demand it. Where am I going? There's a wonderful line in A Portrait of the Lady by Henry James, one of the few feminine novels that I don't actually quote in the book, but I don't love that novel, I have to say. Just part of why I don't quote it, but there's a wonderful line in it where the heroine is asked, "Do you know where you're going, Isabel Archer?" And she says, "No," and I find it very pleasant not to know. So I don't quite know where I'm going. As I say in the introduction of the book, I walked away from a great job and all the responsibilities of life. It was probably the only irresponsible thing I've ever done to write this book. And for the first time in my life, I'm faced with some uncertainty, which is nerve-wracking, but also quite exciting. I hope I get to learn more Talmud and teach more Talmud and write more about Talmud. Yes, there are more books. This book was always written to be the first of a trilogy, so I'm already beginning to think about the second one. God help me, because I am a masochist apparently and ought to have my head examined. I think it's because I grew up in a world where the Talmud was forbidden to me. I will never take it for granted that I'm so blessed in getting to teach it. I'm so grateful for that. I hope I continue to do that. I hope this book goes out and, as I say, helps lay to rest difficulties that other people might be contending with. I hope it opens up archetypal analysis to Talmud scholars, because I do think that's such an amazingly rich way of reading Talmud. I hope it's, moves the needle a little bit in the whole women and Judaism, thing. Although I have to say, with or without this book, I think women and Judaism, we're going to be okay. I think it's easy to get frustrated if you look forwards and realize how far there is still to go. But I'm a big believer in looking backwards as well. And maybe because the world I grew up in has come so far so fast, I'm so grateful for how far we've gone, and I'm very hopeful for the future.
Okay. Lovely place to end. I want to add something to Ari's introduction about Pardes, where you teach. So I am also a student of Pardes. The teacher who I credit with opening me up to this world of Jewish literary interpretation is Judy Klitzner, who happens to be a woman and a very frequent CSP contributor. Not only is my daughter going to be learning there, but my wife also learned there. And when she introduced herself, they have an evening where they go around, the students go around and introduce themselves. My wife told the story of her grandmother, who was the daughter of a rabbi, who asked her dad to teach her Talmud. And the response of my wife's grandmother's father was, "Why do you need to know Talmud to make kasha varnishkas?" So I am particularly gratified that all the women in my life know how to make kasha varnishkas and are pretty handy on a page of Talmud as well. So with that, I would like to open things up. Ari, I don't know how you want to conduct the public questioning, but we could take a look at some of the questions in the chat, or we could ask people to raise their hands.
Well, I think, given the limited time, I've been following the chat. So here are a few quick questions to kind of get to. One was, there's been a demand or a request for a reader's guide to go with the book so that people who can use the book in their own groups. Is that something that you have available or may be available?
So here's the schedule, gang. I launched the book with all of you tonight. In less than 48 hours, I get on a plane and spend a month touring the East Coast and some of the Midwest. And as soon as I get back, one of the first things on my to-do list is put together a guide. And when I do, I will send it to Ari to disseminate it to all of you. So it's absolutely something that I know I need to put together. And thank you for that request.
Second question, people ask about the design of your cover of your book. Can you explain why you chose that design?
So I have it here. Rav Shai and Ari, if you saw me running like 3 minutes before we began, I realized I didn't have a book on hand. So now I have a book on hand. This is why I will never be a TikTok influencer, because I can't hold things up to the camera properly. But the cover design was, there were about 50 sketches that were made to get it there. I knew that I wanted a 19th century cameo, and I knew that I wanted a page of Talmud. And I didn't quite know how to put the two together. And so there were many, 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 many iterations. And then at some point when we were very close to giving up, I had a bubble bath, which is a source of all good ideas. And as I was in the bath, I thought, attic, we're going to take the attic walls, which kind of had this vertical look to them, and we'll superimpose the Talmud onto the vertical attic walls, and that will create the composition. And the brilliant Tani Bayer, who designed the cover, took the idea and ran with it, and I'm really pleased.
That's great. I have shared now, I'll reshare your schedule for the East Coast. People have asked when you'll be in New York, for example. I see you're going to be in Boston when I'm in Boston. So I don't know if I'll get to the Lair House. Have you lectured at the Lair House before? The Jewish
Nope,
Tavern?
first time.
I was actually trying to call them to say, please host Gila Fine when you were there last time. You'll be at my brother's synagogue in Sharon. So if you're in Boston, there's 2 opportunities and probably more in New York. I'll try to share that shortly. People ask the difference between a stereotype and an archetype.
Good question. An archetype is more cultural, more literary, and a stereotype is more sociological. So you would generally impose an archetype on a character in a movie or a book, but you would impose a stereotype on someone IRL in real life. That seems to be the very basic distinction in the scholarship.
So I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this based on the questions, but do you receive negative input to this teaching, and what do you expect is going to happen when this book gets out into the Jewish world at large?
I don't know, and I find it very unpleasant not to know. This is a source of anxiety. It feels very vulnerable to be putting something out there in this way. I suspect that, I mean, okay, based on my teaching, this is my past experience. Whenever, thank God, generally I receive just a lot of very loving responses. On the rare occasion where the response is not loving, it generally is along the lines of the question that Avshai far more graciously posed to me, which is, isn't it too much of a coincidence that you're a feminist and the reading is a feminist and I don't believe you? And my response generally is, that's fair, but if you're going to question the reading, that has to be from within the text. Don't tell me you don't believe me just because I'm a feminist. Show me where you think my reading is inconsistent, either with the words of the text or with the context. And if somebody does, then often I will go away and think about it some more. But more often than not, I find that, you know, because I've really been so incredibly careful and I've worked so long and I've really tried very hard to dot all my I's and cross all my T's, I think the application of the rules to the text, the rules that I set out at the beginning of the book, I want to think that they're sound. And I hope that if anyone critiques the readings in the book, that they do it on the basis of that, not on the basis of just, you know, political agenda.
Rav Shai, do you have any more questions? I mean, there's more in the chat, but I just want to see if you wanted to pose anything at this point before we finish up.
What are you most hopeful for and most afraid of in terms of responses to the book?
I try not to think about that too much. I realized very early on that if I was going to get past my writing paralysis, I had to stop thinking about anyone who wasn't me, and just write the book to my 12-year-old self. And that's what I try to do. And I told myself, this is very self-helpy, but writing was a real struggle. And throughout the process, I had to tell myself, you have to write a book that you are pleased with. And what happens after that is kind of out of your hands. I'm hopeful that people read it. I think I'm most fearful of it not being read. I'm hopeful that people read it. I'm hopeful that people find it inspiring or helpful or moving or interesting or edifying. I'm mostly afraid of it not being read. I suppose I'm afraid of it causing a storm, although there is the philosophy that, you know, all news is good news, and as long as they spell your name right and all that. I don't think I'm going to deal with attacks very well. I'm a bit of a sensitive soul in that respect, and I don't quite have that thick skin. But if they do come my way, I hope that they are. I hope that they're serious. I hope that they're based, as I said, on reading of the text rather than just playing politics.
People ask, when you're not studying Jewish text, what do you read?
Fiction.
Escape.
Fiction.
In particular, do you have anything?
So I've had a very steady diet of very good fiction during my writing years because I needed that to keep myself going. I think you'll see if you read the book that I tried very much to mix it up. So when I do my literary surveys, I start with the Bible, and then I go to Talmud, and then I'll do Greco-Roman mythology and sometimes Egyptian mythology, and then I'll go to like medieval European works, and I try and mix it up. And when I get to early modern works, I'll try and include a few French examples and some Spanish examples and some Russian examples, and obviously American examples. But ultimately, where I always end up doing the most work is the 19th century English novel, because that's, after Talmud, probably my second greatest love.
There was a question, why is the title The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic? Is that has that always been the title, or did that change?
No, that has absolutely not always been the title. The working title of this book was very different. But the Madwoman in the Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic is a subtitle in the first chapter. That is where it comes from. The initial title for the book, I guess I can tell you, was based on the lecture series, which was the basis for this book, and it was something like some sort of iteration of the shrew, the angel, and the femme fatale, 6 Talmudic heroines. And that just felt really long. And I thought, well, I'm mentioning 3, but then I'm saying 6, and that might be confusing. And I realized that actually giving something coherent might be more effective than giving a list. And so the Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic felt right, and it felt like it tied in quite nicely with the 19th century visual that I wanted for the cover, and it all kind of came together from there.
We spoke briefly before the program about the process. Can you just share how long this took and what you went through in writing this book?
And thank you, Naomi. Of course, The Madwoman in the Attic is the inspiration, that wonderful work by Gilbert and Guber. Writing the book was awful. Don't ever do it. Seriously, it's torturous and lonely and miserable. I basically, after spending years teaching this material, I spent a year doing a lot of research. I then spent a solid year in complete emotional paralysis, doing basically nothing. In fact, that was the year I started teaching for CSP, and you guys were a ray of light in my otherwise dark life. That was the first year of lockdown, not coincidentally. And then from when I started, it was about 3 years, start to finish, of writing.
We're very happy that we can be there for you, and that
you absolutely
you
will.
on CSP. Trust me, you have a big audience today, because there's a lot from CSP, and I assume other people as well have joined. If you don't know what CSP is, I should mention, go to occsp.net. I'll do a follow-up about the book and about us, and we hope that we have more people join us. We're all about Jewish learning and hosting the best teachers. I also want to just throw out to Beth Elster. Thank you, Beth, who introduced us to Gila many years ago when you came to Congregation B'nai Israel of Tustin, California.
I will repeat the story that Beth kind of had to ram me down Ari's throat, who was entirely uninterested in having me originally. And I'm glad you came around.
That's not exactly accurate. I just said, who is this person? Are they a good teacher? That's all I asked, because, we have very high standards, We'll have to ask Shai about his writing story, because Shai has written books as well. Maybe, I don't know if that's common, or if this was a particular, maybe now you finish this book, it's going to come much easier for you.
Amen. Probably not, but amen to that.
So my question for you is, you've been interviewed, you're doing lots of programs. If CSP hired you and said you can hire anybody, you can interview anybody in the Jewish world right now, who would you interview, and what would you want to learn from them? And then and I'll let Shai end up, kind of wrap everything up after that.
Sorry, was that a question to me?
Yeah, I said, if we turn the tables and we said, okay, now you've written your book, we're going to give you some time off, you're going to be kind of on retainer for CSP, you get to choose some people to interview in the Jewish world, who would your first guest be and why?
That is a really good question. My first thought is, I hope this isn't a cop-out, but I really would love to talk to the mysterious anonymous editors of the Talmud, the Stamaim, so called because they are anonymous and we don't know who they are, but they are single-handedly responsible in shaping the stories of the Talmud. When I say the rabbis, when I've said the rabbis tonight, and when I say the rabbis in the book, what I mean are these Stamaim. I would love to talk to them about their process and how they saw their own creative endeavor. And I think I kind of would like to see their minds blown at the thought that a woman is actually reading their text, because I don't think they ever envisioned creating their Talmud for a reader like me and many of the people here today.
All right, so Ari, if you're giving me a last shot, I'll extend what I understand Gila to be talking about. So if you know Rashi, okay, 85% of Rashi's comments on the Talmud are from rabbinic sources that he puts together. But sometimes those sources that he puts together produce an entirely different reading than either of those earlier sources would ever have imagined. It's the same thing with the Stamaim in the Talmud, that they bring together different voices, and without playing ventriloquist, without having those different voices say anything other than what they said, simply by virtue of the framing and the sequences of those voices, the Stamaim can create something radically new and innovative, or, in keeping with my waistcoat, innovative. And so Gila...
No one says that.
Really?
No.
Oh, okay, all right. But my wish for you is that in addition to doing this kind of exegesis from the Talmud, you take the Stamaim as a model, right? And you create with Talmud and with Midrash and with the breadth of rabbinic literature, something that, even if you want to say that it's anonymously Gila, right? But for you to bring your whole self, b'chavanah, with consciousness, to this enterprise that keeps the Torah from being petrified wood and keeps it in Eitz Chaim, because this is what we need, and your voice is so important in the Jewish people's journey in creating a forest of Eitzei Chaim, and we look forward to more coming from you. My last word, encore.
Thank you so much.
We wish you safe travels on the East Coast of the United States and nice weather, hopefully. And if you're in the East Coast, we've shared the schedule. People have pointed out the schedule had a few issues in it. have to fix just so that the dates work. I think there's one date that has. I'll email you. So hopefully you can get a chance to see Gila Fine live and in person. Take your friends, get the book, learn, and thank you for joining us, CSP. And we're very happy to have shared this international launch. Looking forward to your next book, Gila.
Mazel tov, Gila.
Thank you,
Safe
Lakshay.
travels.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Take care. Happy whatever day it is, Tuesday.